So today I'm going to speak to a guy called Stephen Rooney, who is a writer for the game called Divinity Original Sin 2. And I'm just going to give you a little heads up. This talk is going to be literally filled with spoilers. So welcome to the newest episode of the Story Podcast. And today I have one of the writers of one of the finest role-playing epics of all time, as it was said by GameSpot. It is Stephen Rooney. So how are you doing today, Stephen?
I'm doing very well, thank you, and thank you for the compliment on the game. We're very happy for it.
Well, it is quite an accomplishment to make a game like this. It's very, very well regarded by role players all over the world.
Yeah, I think there's a real sense of that because so many of us who've been kind of working on it have come from traditions of role playing and traditions of storytelling, and like our boss Sven Vinke, who kind of is the driving force, the engine behind everything that Larian does. He spends all of his time kind of talking about how his childhood was shaped by Ultima 7 and Baldur's Gate and Neverwinter Nights and all of these
Mm.
things. So yeah, no, we like to think we have pedigree of some sort.
Mm. So you're from Dublin, right?
That's right.
So how did your background in Dublin influence the way you wrote for this game in any way?
Um, yeah, in part, I think it did. I mean, being in Ireland, there's a lot of fairy tales and there's a lot of myths and there's a lot of different kind of aspects of storytelling that are kind of baked into the culture. Kind of like the idea of people in a thatched cottage sitting around a fireplace telling stories is the traditional kind of image. But we really loved that idea and that idea as of us as storytellers. Um, and I think we've managed to bring like little bits of Irishness and little Irish names that kind of dropped in there. But it's been it's been fantastic to do it with uh, people who are Irish and Belgian and American, kind of all bringing different pieces to the table.
Hmm. So I can't imagine that this was your first job. so,
No, no, I
so,
didn't.
so,
I did. I
so
did.
did you write anything else before landing this job at Larian Games?
Um, yeah, I've written all kinds of bits and pieces all over the place. Not as much of it was as creative as I'd like. I studied English and then specialized in history in university, and kind of came out of that and got quite lucky. I managed to land myself a job at a relatively new studio that I just set up in Dublin called Jolt Online Games. They made like Facebook games, so I was. If you imagine stuff like Farmville or that very
Mm.
simple stuff, and they just needed kind of text to be put in there. But that was an introduction to it, and then I went and spent some time writing a bunch of marketing copy and selling my soul so I could, eat and live and those
Mm.
like frivolous little things. But in the end, this job came along and it was just too good not to go at it with everything that I had and to try and land it. And it worked out pretty well.
Mm. Well, you made some characters in this game. Um, One that you wrote about, not about that you wrote. I think did you write Fane is in his entirety, or did you
Yeah,
yeah.
I pretty much. I mean, so the story of Fane is that Chris Avellone was working with us on the overarching story, and then there had been the idea that he would also write an origin character, or he would come up with the concept of an origin character. And this was a point where the other origin characters were kind of established and already worked into the story. But there was this kind of hole that was missing because Fane is an eternal, and he was, this kind of like race that mysteriously vanished long ago, but nobody in the world really knows about them. And we were really struggling to actually tell the story of this race that vanished because nobody knows they were there. And so
Mm.
you're finding like old pieces of archaeology, and no one would actually know what they were. So Chris had the idea to have Fane be an undead member of the Eternals, so someone who comes back, and that sets him apart from the world, and that lets him tell the story of his people as he kind of moves through the world. And it was a fantastic way to bring a lot of lore very, very easily into the story, very naturally into the game. So yeah, Chris came up with it, and then it was handed to me, and I wrote mostly all of it. I think there's probably a few places kind of here and there where people needed to pitch in and fix things that I'd messed up or something. But yeah, pretty much in his entirety.
So you mentioned that he Fane was from. Was it a place called the Eternal, or is it more like a people?
Sorry, yeah, the Eternals are a people. The idea was that they were the first people in the world of Rivellon, and they had these. They were nearly kind of godlike. And then I don't know how much you want me to spoil the story
Just
or to get
spoil
into.
everything, Stephen.
Okay, fantastic.
I'll
The
make
idea is
sure to put in some spoilers before.
excellent. Okay. Yeah, so the story of the Eternals is that they were these first people in the world, and there was nobody else, and they were different and varied. Then there was a. I'll skim over most of the details, but there ended up being a civil war amongst them, with their seven lords of the Eternals kind of fighting their king and their people, with some stuff that Fane had to do with. We don't need to get into that yet. And yeah, basically the Eternals were kind of like wiped away from the earth for the most part. The seven lords who rebelled were still alive. They remained in the world, and they became the seven gods. And each one of them kind of made a race, and so they repopulated the world, and they created the world kind of anew again. And this is the world that Fane then steps into, where he has no idea what's going on. But there's all these humans who look like the god Ralek that he used to know kind of back in the day. And there's all these dwarves that look like the god Duna. So that's why he's really so confused at the start of the game. And you get to explain the world to him as you progress.
So when you came up with this concept for Fane, did it come up like midway through the process of making the game? Because it sounds like that this is like the lore you wrote for this is like the basic how the world came to be and how the gods rose.
Um, yeah, the way that we work is in a very kind of iterative way. Like we'll have the lore and the story of the world, and then we realize, oh, it's really hard to tell this story unless you have someone in the game that knows the story. And then we put in Fane so he can explain the story, but then you realize, oh no, because Fane's doing this and his character is this, it would be much better if the lore was a little bit different. So you go and you change the lore, and you bounce back and forth between the two of them until everything kind of fits very well and very naturally. Fane came a little later in the game than the other origin characters. Himself and Beast were yeah, we would have got into them kind of towards the middle of the project, whereas the other ones had been done a little earlier. But everything gets revised and edited so many times that it's if Fane had been there from day one, he would now look completely different to what he did. So
this really like I can't like wrap my head around on where to start writing this character, because I played until Act 3. So I have experience until that part with Fane mostly, but there are all these kind of situations that this guy can get into. So how is it just like sit down? Okay, I have to do this section before I can progress to the next section of writing, or is it more like you communicate with the guys who are making another origin character, or is it more fluid?
it's very, very fluid, and I think each origin character probably took their own path to get where they are. Um, the way that it worked with Fane was we started with Chris's idea, obviously, which was Fane's backstory, the story of the Eternals and of the war and of Fane being kind of locked away in a tomb, and then being able to kind of reemerge into the world when his tomb was accidentally opened. and so he's wandering around as an undead. Um, and from that, I started trying to get Fane's voice, basically. He'd been described to me as someone who should be kind of a bit of Sherlock Holmes and a bit of Dr. House, that kind of like
Mm.
acidic personality and kind of cutting tone. So yeah, I started just trying to get into his head and looking at his backstory and seeing what's that going to do to a person's mind, and then how would they speak, how would they interact with the world, and then you start looking at the main plot and you say, okay, well these are big obvious points where he can have big, um, obvious kind of interactions with the main story as it exists. So one of the first big obvious thing is there's a point in Act One where you get pulled into the Hall of Echoes for the first time, and you meet your god for the first time. And for a lot of the origin characters, it's a very particular kind of experience. Ifin goes forward and he meets Rollick, the god of the humans, and it's this person you've been praying to forever. And the Red Prince goes in and meets Zorlstissa and meets the goddess of the lizards, and there's this kind of back and forth. When Fane goes into the Hall of Echoes, Fane's experience is he meets Amadia, the god of the wizards, but she's just this person that he used to know back in the day. So he has a very, very different kind of
Mm.
conversation with her. Um, and you look at all those big points in the story where you can say, okay, this is definitely uh, something where he's going to have a very different experience or he has something to contribute. You try and fill those in kind of as best you can, and then you go into the smaller details throughout the story
Mm.
and just see, okay, where are the places where Fane can have a funny remark or just a cutting jab, or he can do something that's just a little bit different. So you have this more unique experience the whole way through the game, and not just at these couple of points.
Because that's something that I really like about this game is that every origin character feels very unique compared to the others.
Yeah, they really are. It was always a case of one writer is assigned to each origin character. So I feel very protective of,
Mm.
of Fane in a weird way, and I put a lot of myself into Fane. Um, and I know Charlene Putney, who would have written Ifin, kind of had a lot of ideas that she wanted to put in there, and Sarah Bayless did Losa, and there's a lot of her in the character. Um, so yeah, in a lot of cases, we kind of take these characters and we carry them the whole way through the game, and they pick up your own voice in a way, or they pick up characteristics that they would maybe share with you.
Mm.
Um, and so that means that each of them do have a very, very distinct feel and a very, very distinct kind of just way of looking at the world. And also they're just really cool, ridiculous characters. I mean, Sven made sure of that. There was no way we're going to just get, oh, this person's a barbarian or this person's a priest in there. They all have to have crazy, ridiculous, just powerful backstories that can
Mm.
carry you through, like a game that you might be playing for 80 or 100 hours.
Exactly. It won't be at least to me it won't be fun to like play like the normal dude. You
Yeah,
know?
no,
So
that's
so
the
so
thing.
so a elaborate over the top background story really helps.
Yeah, no, it really does.
Yeah. Before you mentioned when you're writing for Fane, for example, you mentioned a little bit about how to get in the mindset about writing like his voice.
Yeah.
So how exactly did you do it with Fane?
Um, I had the advantage of having a lot of I could ask the other writers who had kind of gone through the same process with their characters, and they could come to me and they could say, this is what worked with me for this character. This has worked for me for another one. Um, I think Sarah at some point told me that she had started to have conversations with Losa. That sounds much crazier than it actually is. It's a kind of a writing technique that she'd come up with, but where basically, and this is something that I tried, where I'll just sit down at a page and I'll start typing as me, and I'll ask a question into the page, and I'll ask it to Fane, and then I'll type Fane's response, and then I'll type mine, and you have kind of just a conversation between you and the character. And as you're going through it, it takes a bit of, it's a very weird experience. You nearly have to kind of split your brain in two and quickly flip from his voice to your voice and back and forth. But you pick up little weird ticks and little weird characteristics and just interesting things that he has to say, or interesting ways that he might say something. And because you're not writing to a script that you have pre-done, the conversation can go anywhere, and you can actually, your subconscious will throw up some very interesting and kind of like just weird stuff. So that's mostly kind of how I got his voice. I think I went and watched just a bunch of episodes of House as well, just but that was mostly for fun. Um, but yeah, that helps a lot.
Yeah, so it's almost kind of acting, but with yourself.
Yeah, that's a really good way of
Yeah,
putting it, actually. It very much is like an improv class
yeah,
between you and you. Yeah, no, that works.
yeah. So so you do this with all the characters you write. Do you do this? We can say this acting exercise.
Not necessarily with everyone. I did it specifically with Fane because he's someone that you need to have such a good grasp of his voice, of the voice that you'll write him in, and the his attitude towards things and his attitude towards like a bunch of different things. But if you're writing a dwarf that's in a market and he's selling some cheese, you don't need to get anywhere near that in depth um, with the character. So you would do that for very, very major characters. But in most cases, if it's someone who just exists in one spot, you don't need to go that far. It would be a waste of time because you're
Hmm.
not going to get much more out of the conversation than you would if you just sat down and thought this is an interesting idea or this is an interesting kind of voice and just wrote the few lines that you need to write.
To my experience, I haven't played like an undead race that had that even spoke or even had intelligence. So it was kind of refreshing to get a totally different take that what I was expecting of an undead something.
Yeah, I mean, I ended up writing a lot of the undead as well, and I was even doing that before Fane. I don't know if that's why they gave it to me, or if I became kind of more interested in the undead because of Fane. Um, yeah, no, the undead in Divinity, and particularly in Original Sin 2, are really interesting. 'Cause, I mean, on the one hand, you can play as one, and you don't just play as a skeleton. You can play as a well, you can play as a human skeleton, dwarf skeleton, lizard skeleton, elf skeleton, um, which adds a whole other layer to what you have to be ready for in a conversation.
Mm.
But writing the undead NPCs was a whole lot of fun. And again, the voice was kind of difficult for them because you can't just write an undead as if they were someone that's alive, because then there's no sparkle, there's nothing interesting there. So you have to write them in kind of like a slightly older way, or you give them some particular quirk. But also, because we have undead lizards and undead elves and undead humans, and the lizards and elves and humans and dwarves, each of them in the game have a particular way of speaking. That means you have to give each of your undeads, or each undead character you write, it has to speak. Um, if you're writing an undead dwarf, it has to sound like a dwarf, but it can't sound like a living dwarf. If you have to write an undead lizard, they can't sound like a living lizard, but they also can't sound like an undead dwarf. You end up with these different layers of kind of filters that you have to put on the characters when you're trying to figure out um, what exactly this sounds like. Because all undead kind of have to share a same trait, but they also all have to be different.
Yeah. So when you're putting on these layers that you're speaking of, is it more we can say a dialect than a or I don't know what it's called. Is it a dialect or is it more something more elaborate? Um,
Um, it's what I tended to do for the undead was just to take the traits that I associate with their living races and just roll that back kind of a few years and roll it back into the past a little bit. So writing an undead lizard, the lizards are very well spoken, and the lizards are very they have kind of a very opulent
Mm.
idea to them. So if you think, okay, well then what would a much older lizard sound like? You end up writing something that's nearly kind of Shakespearean, and that's much more over the top, and that's just kind of grandiose. If you're writing a dwarf, then you could give them just more kind of unusual sayings, because the dwarves are very informal and they have um, kind of a fun, playful way of speaking. So you kind of just bounce it back, you amp it up a little bit, and just like sprinkle a layer of dust on it. Basically,
Mm.
try and make sure it feels like something that's a bit older and a bit out of sync with the world around it.
So, was it the intention when this game was made to build on the stereotypes of a fantasy dwarf or a fantasy setting?
Oh no, very much against it. Actually,
Yeah.
we really really didn't want to make a game where you can go in and say, well, these are clearly dwarves and these are clearly elves and these are clearly lizards. It's a little bit harder. The elves are the best example of this, in that they we had the idea that the elves should always speak in the present tense, because in Rivellon, elves, they can die, but they can also technically be immortal. They don't age in anywhere near the same way that humans or dwarves do, which means that an elf will have a very different perception of time. And we had the idea that like everything will be present tense for them,
Mm.
and that was very difficult to work into every single dialogue. So we ended up having the idea that, okay, wilder elves will speak this way, and then elves who have been more in contact with civilization will have a still accented and still weird way of speaking, but also, but they won't have this very, very strict rule that they have to speak in the present tense at all times. Um, but it was a really cool little quirk to give the elves, because that doesn't you don't get that anywhere else, but it still makes sense. Um, we tried a couple of things with the dwarves before, and I just basically none of it really worked brilliantly. Everything we wrote for them was more confusing than it
Mm.
was interesting. So we ended not quite defaulting back to the way that like a traditional dwarf would speak. They don't all sound like Gimli. Um, they all kind of sound a bit like a little bit just kind of like working class or regional UK, or
Mm.
however you describe that. Um, but no, we're very much against playing to the stereotypes. It's important that in our game, if you see something, it's something that you haven't seen before.
Exactly, because when I if we go back to Fane, it really brings my attention to the game that, oh, okay, so this undead guy is speaking like Sherlock Holmes. So what else in the game is new and different? And if I then encounter something that's building on stereotypes, I go, oh, okay,
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, I know. And it's not a perfect game. I'm sure there are places in there where you find something that's just kind of expected, or was an easy joke, or was
Mm.
whatever. But we do try. It's a very big game. We try very very hard to give each moment of it a little something special. So yeah, but
It's not a perfect game, but it's just really, really, really good.
yes, we are very very happy with how it
Right.
turned out, and a lot of the feedback from it has been fantastic. So
Mm. So you also wrote about the demons in the game, right?
I wrote some of the demons in the game. Yeah, I didn't write all of them or anything like that. But there's a point in the game called Blood Island, which is well, it's an island covered in blood and undulating flesh and weird, creepy trees. It's horrific. I have no idea what problems the art department has, but they're very deep-seated psychological issues. No, but it looks amazing and it looks weird and it looks unexpected. Um, but this island is full of demons, and yeah, I got to write some of the demons there, which was a whole lot of fun. Because with the undead or with lizards or whatever, you have to have kind of a unifying factor. You have to have something that they all share. Demons are creatures from another world, and demons are very individualistic in our game, and they all have different qualities. A lot of them would have kind of different powers, but it means that you it also means you can give them all very different voices and very different kind of ticks. So one of the characters that I wrote on Blood Island has an intentionally ridiculously over the top kind of way of speaking. He will never use one word if he can use four, and all the words are big and flowery, and it's everything that you try and avoid. But I just kind of like went nuts on that guy. And there's another demon which is a perfectly polite demon, but he's inhabiting the body of a human who's a raging psychopath. So every now and then, kind of the demon will be saying, "Yes, well, if we only looked over here," and then the human bursts in with like, "Kill, murder, blah." So that's you can play around with a lot of different weird ideas, and it's really fun to just chuck them in. And then you have to listen to voice recording, try and make any sense out of it, and
Hmm.
it's so much fun.
So it all seems kind of dark. Writing about undead, writing about demons. So is this something that have been a tendency in your writing, in a sense?
Okay. Yeah. It's
Or
it,
does it
it,
come more natural than to write about a posh elf?
um it's a really good question. um, I think there are certain people who will kind of gravitate towards certain styles of writing and ways of doing it, and for me that it like, honestly it does feel like a very natural thing to write about. I find it very easy to go to weird, unusual, dark places in my imagination.
Hmm?
I'm very chipper and cheerful and don't need too much therapy, but it's yeah, it's something that comes naturally. My stuff either tends to be very, very light and airy fairy, or kind of grim and heavy. So we're very, very lucky with the selection of writers that we had, where
Hmm.
everyone had kind of a niche that they could fill, and some of them were fantastic at writing kind of a romance scene, or just a really human interaction between two people, or a family situation, or everyone had their little specialities, and it was great that we could all come together and fill our niches in the game.
Hmm. So how does this writing, what do you call it? Why did you begin writing? Because it's not something that I myself picked up. It didn't came natural as drawing to me. Um,
Yeah. I don't know. That's again, it's a good question. I've kind of been writing for nearly as long as I can remember. I know that when I was a kid, I would like sometimes draw little stupid comics and kind of write little ridiculous jokes in there. And I remember as a teenager, kind of like making little fake newspaper pages with
hmm,
fake stories for my friends just to kind of entertain people. Um, and then when I grew up into an adult, if I've ever grown up, I realized that you could get paid for it, and I was like, well, let's just carry on with this. I don't know. I've always read a lot, and reading really, really made me want to write, which is an experience I don't have anywhere else. I don't watch the World Cup and think, oh God, I really need to play professional football. Like I just kind of think, oh, that looks exhausting. No, I'll just go and sit in a dark corner for a while and write a demon.
yeah. Well, it's exactly that feeling that I have with me and drawing, because I always in my childhood I have always made like these treasure maps.
Hmm.
So when I found out that okay, I can actually live off drawing stuff, so now I'm drawing maps for D&D enthusiasts around the world. So that's
That's
awesome.
awesome. Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah.
No, it's fantastic when you find something that you feel you have a calling towards. You
Mhm.
nearly just you would have to fight not to do it, and find out you can get paid for it. Like it's a great feeling.
It's the greatest. So let's head back to the development of the Divinity Original Sin 2. Did you encounter any what can you say setbacks or something that like made your writing more difficult in a sense?
Um, yeah, I mean, there were definitely times where we didn't do as well as we should have done. And Sven is a very, very good. He has an excellent eye for what's good and for what's bad, and most importantly for what can be better. So there were definitely times where he kind of came in and said like, look, guys, this just isn't working, or that it's fine, but like it could be excellent. I remember one of the very early after I'd joined the company, kind of, and a big bunch of the writers joined at the same time. They went from a team of two people writing for the original Sin, and up to seven writing for this. Um, and we'd been writing kind of little bits and pieces, and Sven came over and he said, "Guys, the stuff that you're writing, they're Smurfs. Your elves are little happy little people living in a happy little woodland, and none of it's real and none of it's kind of grafted into the world." So he bought us all little Smurf figurines and presented each one of us with a little Smurf figurine that just to remind us what not to do. And I think all of us have had them kind of sitting on top of our computer screens through the entire project, just reminding us to keep stuff grounded and to keep stuff real and to keep stuff just to keep everything believable and fixed in the world.
Mm. So he actually gave you something to run away from this.
Yeah, he has.
Yeah.
I'm looking at it now. I have a little kind of generic Smurf sitting on my computer screen, and he's just kind of staring at me, just saying never again. Just a reminder of what I need to avoid. I think the lesson sunk in eventually.
Mm. So the definitive edition is coming up, and from what I have seen in the new video that Sven uploaded to
Hmm.
to the Kickstarter, it's a major takeover.
Yeah, it's going to be a pretty big change for a lot of things. In terms of the story that's there, we put a lot more work into the beginning and into the end. Because Act 3 and stuff in Arcs, there was a lot of really cool stuff there, but we didn't feel that we had the time to develop the stories as much as we wanted. We didn't feel that we had the time to make the city feel as real and as alive that we wanted. And also, some of the quests were confusing and they went all over the place. And yeah, it just didn't feel right compared to the quality that we felt the rest of the game had. Um, so we put a lot of effort into going into arcs and kind of yanking up a lot of it and just shuffling stuff around and trying to make sure that the motivations of all the characters were clear. And there was a lot of little bits of tweaking kind of everywhere. And the ending got a big revamp as well, kind of narratively speaking.
Mm.
And there's just a lot more sense in there. There's a lot more stuff in there that makes sense now. We've updated the journal, which is going to help you. Uh, it's going to help guide you basically on the quests a bit more. Not to make it easy, but just to make sure that the things that you're being told make sense.
Mm.
Which is sometimes they kind of didn't. It got a little sparse, and sometimes people were looking to that they had to go to like walkthroughs and stuff to find out what was happening next, and you never ever want that to happen. You never
No,
want someone
no.
to have to leave your game to try and figure out what the hell is going on in your game. Everything should be there, all the information should be there, and everything should be displayed in a way that people can easily access.
Mm,
Not that puzzles and stuff are going to be easy to solve, not that the mysteries are going to be easy to uncover, but it mechanically it shouldn't be difficult. Narratively, it should still be kind of ridiculous sometimes.
mm,
But we redid the start as well. And we added another. You start on a ship, and that was basically where you have your tutorial. You wake up, you find out that you have a source collar on you, which is going to stop you from using your most powerful magic. You meet the origin characters, and it gives you a little idea of how the game works. We realized that from feedback, particularly, that we were throwing a lot of information at players, and they didn't really have the space to absorb that, particularly if they hadn't played the previous game and they didn't know how a lot of the similar mechanics kind of worked. So we added another layer to another deck to the ship. So you now start off one layer down, and you go through a tutorial. It's a little more meandering. There's more characters in there. It's more interesting. There's more kind of like fun little situations. So it's not like you're just being told kind of, oh, click here to move over here, click here to move this water barrel or whatever else. It's all built really well into the game. And yeah, we think that's gonna really help with the story. There's a ton of other changes as well. There's changes to the combat. There's changes to every sort of mechanic. But I didn't have very much to do with those, so I worry that if I say anything, I'll just get it wrong, and then the marketing department will shout at me. So we'll try and avoid that.
So, one thing I have to ask about is like, who is that Sir Laura the Squirrel Knight?
Yes, Sir Laura. He's another character that I got. I had the privilege to meet. So Laura is a character who's going to be available in the DLC. He's not, or he's going to be available in the definitive edition. He's not he's not an origin per se. He's kind of like a mini origin character. He'll follow you around a bit, and he has his own story. He has his own tale that he tells as you go through the world, and he has his own things that he interacts with. But yeah, he's just your typical kind of squirrel knight who's riding a skeleton cat and trying to prevent the apocalypse, which he calls the coming of the great acorn. It's a totally normal, everyday Larian story. He's
Coming
actually
of the Great Acorn.
coming of the great acorn. Yeah, that's what it is. It's actually been a running gag in kind of a few Larian games, I think. Particularly in the original Sin, there was the idea that you would have little squirrels kind of bouncing around talking about the coming of the great acorn, and it was just, or talking about like kind of grand scale wars or these things. Because it was just so much fun for people who don't have Pet Pal, the ability that lets you talk to animals. To just go, oh, happy little squirrels bouncing around the thing. But once you actually talk to them, you're like, oh my god, they're apocalyptic cultists, and they're trying to lead armies, and they're trying to do all this stuff. So it was a lot of fun to actually get down and really work on a character like that. I don't want to say too much more about him, just because he's not out yet, and there's still a lot more to there's still a lot more to reveal.
You mentioned Pet Pal. That's one of my favorite, what I call traits, talents. Because you can like go the whole game without getting that.
Yeah, and it won't stop you from doing anything in the game.
No.
That's you can progress like the entire way through. But if you have it, then you kind of unlock this whole other level of story that's going on. Like animals will give you hints, or they'll give you quests, and yeah, there's a lot going on with Pet Pal. Kind of, I remember at the start of Act 2, there's one situation where you can just walk past a clutch of chickens, but if you go over and you talk to them, and you can talk to them, you realize that their eggs have been kidnapped and their baby has been snatched away, and you have to go off, and it's been turned into a void woken, and there's all sorts of drama and all sorts of madness. But it's a wonderful, wonderful skill, and writing the animals is so much fun.
I could imagine that. Um, how does someone become like you, like a game writer?
Um, I mean, the kind of natural answer for me is dumb luck. That's not true, but it really feels like it sometimes that you're just okay. Luck plays a really big part in it,
Hmm.
obviously. Um, the game writing industry is kind of a strange beast. It's very, very niche, but crazily broad at the same time. Uh, People in our company who've come here and who've joined the writing team, some of them come from game writing backgrounds. Some of them are from TV and film writing. Some of them have written novels. Like I did a bunch of marketing stuff, and some people are just kind of English majors. So your background isn't as important as if you wanted to be, say, like a script or a programmer or something. The most important thing is that you can write, that you can write well, and you can write clearly, and you can write consistently. Um, and so stuff like just forcing yourself to write every day if you can, and just showing people the stuff that you're writing. These are all important things to take into mind.
Hmm.
Knowing how to write. You'd be amazed how many people just don't know how commas work or something like that. And if you
Hmm.
can't get past that very, very basic level, then you're not going anywhere. Um, I think if I was to talk about getting into game writing specifically, uh, reach out to as many different studios as you can, particularly indie studios or smaller studios, because you're not necessarily going to start in your career writing Assassin's Creed, um, or just kind of jumping into one
Hmm.
of the
Hmm.
big studios. Uh, the things that I'd say if you're looking for particularly like RPGs, play around with Twine is one of the things that I found very, very helpful. It's a branching dialogue tool that just lets you tell very simple little text-based stories, and it's a really, really good way of just getting into the mindset of, okay, these are the things that this is the information that I need to deliver, and this is how big a branching dialogue can get if you let it just go crazy. Um, just kind of knowing the basics of like how a narrative arc works and hero's journey. These are kind of like things that pop up a lot in movies and in TV series, but they're very relevant for games as well.
Hmm.
Um, Although I think the one piece of advice that I've given everyone who's asked me this is go and run a Dungeons and Dragons game. Just sit down and be a DM,
Yeah.
just and create a story and bring people in and have them sit around and have them ruin your story just like within the first 5 minutes and try and just improv your way through it. And it gives you a sense of different voices that people are going to use and different situations that people are going to find fun. Because a lot of the time, what you write down you think is going to be hilarious isn't hilarious to actually play. There's a lot of stuff that's fun to write, but is terrible to read.
I tried this so many times in my games.
Yeah.
Like you have such a clear idea of where you want your party to go, and then oh, there's a shiny thing over there.
Yeah.
And then they just run off, and you have oh, but you need to talk to this guy too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Guys, you missed the secret lever behind the bookcase. You just oh no, you've just used dynamite to blow up the door. Okay,
Exactly.
this is where we're going now. That's fine. Yeah, it's tremendous fun, and it's a really, really good tool for learning what players like and how you need to look at things from multiple different directions to make sure that it works.
But also, as if we're speaking of the DM role, it gives such a perspective into like world building and character building, and also like acting and improvisation. It has all these great benefits
Yeah,
like to influence your way to be a writer. I think.
yeah, no, it absolutely does, and they're all like genuinely vital things, and they're things that people might not necessarily think about. But you need to craft a world that people are going to believe in. You need to have characters that people will believe in, and you need to be able to tell your story in a clear way. And when people go kind of off script, you need to be able to improvise. You need to
Mm.
be able to kind of predict what people will find attractive and what people are going to be bored by. So I think any DM who's sat down as when their party has walked into the big boss, and then the DM kind of delivers a 5 minute speech about how incredible and mighty this boss is. You a minute in, people are playing with their phones, and you
Mm.
realize like this is terrible. So you need to be keep people's attention all the time. You need to be sharp and clever,
Mm.
and just direct. And yeah, no, it's wonderful. Everyone should do it.
Exactly. So let's wrap this podcast up by saying that everyone should play D&D.
It's if it hasn't been brought into law yet, it should be. Yes, no,
Yeah.
everyone should absolutely play D&D.
So thank you so much for being on my podcast, Stephen.
Thank you,
it was
thank you so much for
great
inviting
speaking
me.
to you.
It's really really good speaking to you too. I had a blast. Thank you so much.
So this was the podcast I did with Stephen Rooney, the writer, or one of the writers of Divinity Original Sin 2. It was very fun speaking to him. I sure learned a lot, and I hope you did too. If you like this podcast, make sure to head over to iTunes to give it a rating, and head into my new Facebook page and to make sure to give it a like. You can find the link down below.